Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Energy Policy in the Pacific Northwest session of the AEA West conference. My name is Carrie Mead. I'm the Executive Director of the Northwest Energy Efficiency Council, and I will be your moderator for this session today. I am now going to introduce our first panelist, Emily Kubiak. Emily is with Sustainable Connections, a nonprofit that connects, educates, and supports local businesses to create thriving communities. And she's going to be talking with us today about small business energy efficiency.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Larson Kubiak. I work with Sustainable Connections, and I am here to speak with you about my decade of experience working on a community energy efficiency program and the lessons I've learned working in the small commercial sector. I'm really excited to be here today. I've participated in this conference several times in the past. It's my first time speaking, and it's a little bit of a different format than I was anticipating, but really looking forward to networking and connecting with you. So feel free to reach out in the virtual platform after my talk if you want to discuss anything. So as I mentioned, I am an employee of a small nonprofit called Sustainable Connections. We were founded about 18 years ago in Bellingham, Washington in Whatcom County. And we began around a Think Local First campaign. That was sort of our first project. I think most of you are probably familiar with that movement. But since that time, we've expanded into 5 different program areas. And within all of those areas, we provide education, resources, marketing, networking opportunities, um, chances to educate local businesses around different areas of economic and environmental sustainability. As you probably suspect, I work within the Energy Efficiencies and Renewables program. I'm the program coordinator and an energy auditor. So our flagship program under the Energy Efficiency and Renewables program is the Community Energy Challenge, and that's what I'm really here to talk about today. It's a partnership between Sustainable Connection, who works on the commercial side of things. We work with local businesses, and Opportunity Council, which is a local community action agency that offers similar home weatherization and residential energy efficiency services. So what is the Community Energy Challenge? It was founded around the big idea of creating a one-stop shop for energy efficiency so that homeowners and business owners can have a place to go with their questions around how to reduce their energy use. We provide expertise and a neutral third party to help them navigate all the different aspects of energy management. Our process begins with an energy audit. There's myself and one other energy auditor who perform those. We go through the buildings, identify all of the energy efficiency opportunities to be had, and then we can help with implementation of energy efficiency retrofits. That looks like providing project management services, helping them sort through different bids and different options, helping perform calculations to anticipate the projected energy savings. And we're fortunate enough through our funding mechanisms to be able to provide financial rebates and incentives for some of those energy efficiency improvements as well to help move those forward. We are focused solely around working in existing buildings. There's lots of great programs for new construction, and luckily the current building and energy codes at least help most buildings get up to a minimum standard. But in our service territory, which is Whatcom, Skagit, San Juan, and Island counties, there's so much old building stock, and many of the small businesses are in there. And so a lot of them haven't even had one round of modernizing energy efficiency upgrades. So that's where we focused our efforts. A big part of our mission is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We do that through these energy efficiency upgrades, as well as lately we've been focusing on electrification efforts as well, as our state has mandated decarbonizing the electric grid. Anytime that we can get someone on especially a more efficient electric source, that's going to have an increase in carbon reduction over time as the grid decarbonizes. So that's something we're focused on. Another thing that's really built into our DNA is job creation. This program actually started in 2009 with funding from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which was really a job creation stimulus program to help with economic recovery from the 2008 recession. And so it's really part of our mission by helping businesses identify these energy efficiency upgrades. It creates work for local contractors to complete these projects. And then finally, I'll speak a little bit later, but at Sustainable Connections, we're all about the local economy, and there's a really cool concept called the local economic multiplier effect. And I think a lot of what we do plays into helping keep money circulating in our local economy. So I began with the program shortly after its inception. I began working at Sustainable Connections in 2010, and I'm sort of a repository of institutional knowledge about the Commercial Community Energy Challenge program. So I just want to share a little bit of that with you today. I could do a half-hour talk on each of my slides and get really into the nitty-gritty, but hopefully I'll share some high-level lessons. And if you have any questions, reach out to me. But first of all, I'm going to address why we focus on small and medium-sized businesses, talk a little bit, share a few metrics that I'm excited to see with some of our energy reduction and carbon reduction wins, share a little bit about the economic case for focusing on small commercial energy efficiency, and some of the things that I've learned from working with that sector, as well as just a brief examination of some of my hopes for the future of the program and similar efforts. So why do we work with small businesses? In our program, we actually don't have any limit on the size of business we can work with, and we do occasionally work with larger entities. I actually performed a lighting audit at the Alcoa plant in Ferndale, and we've been approached by similar large organizations in the past, but we've really chosen to focus our efforts on the small and medium sized in the sector for a few reasons. First of all, you can see from the statistic, just the majority of businesses in Whatcom County, Washington, and the country are small to medium-sized businesses, which are family-owned or controlled, or otherwise, locally owned. One of the great things about local business is the management is right there locally. It's probably the person you're talking to, or you have access to them. So if they want to make changes, they have that ability without going through an onerous corporate structure. So that's one of the nice things about working in that sector. We also provide energy management services that, most large businesses and campuses definitely have facilities managers, maintenance contracts, budget for capital improvements. And it's not that small businesses don't have those things, but there's often a gap there, and we serve our goal is to serve them by helping fill in that gap with what we're able to offer where they don't necessarily have those resources. The Clean Buildings Act passed recently in our state. I'm a huge fan of this. It's first a voluntary compliance and then phased in requirements for any buildings over 50,000 square feet to reduce their energy use to hit certain targets. I think this is a really smart approach. 6% of our buildings in our state fit in that category, but they're responsible for 20% of the carbon emissions in the commercial building sector. So you get huge bang for your buck focusing on those large buildings, but that still leaves a huge slice of the pie on the table, and that's those small and medium-sized businesses. And so working with those in aggregate, there's still a large amount of energy efficiency improvements to be had in that sector. So obviously one of our big goals is to help businesses save energy, and there's a lot of ways we could sort of talk about those outcomes. What I decided to share with you today is a statistic that I calculated recently that I was excited to see, that 67% of the businesses where we provided an incentive for a capital project that they ended up implementing within the last 2 years ended up saving more than 25% of their on-site energy use through that project. Actually, one of the ways that we get to that statistic, which is pretty cool, is many of them after 10 years of this program existing, were coming back and completing their third or fourth project with us. So that's how they tipped over into that higher category, which is great because a big part of our goal is to really be on our business participants' team. So when they are looking at doing an energy efficiency upgrade, they come to us as part of that process. And we're really seeing that with those that return for future projects. And another way that I like to look at our outcomes when I'm thinking about kind of my personal impact and ability to affect change. In the last year, this month to the same time last year, we were able to reduce CO2 equivalent emissions by 250 metric tons, which is the same as taking 70 of my house off the grid for a year. Depending on what circles you run in, that either sounds huge or tiny, depends on your frame of reference. To me, with our small team of 4 people who aren't all full-time and pretty lean budget, I feel like that's an amazing outcome and shows that with greater resources, we could have a greater impact. The other cool thing about that is these are durable savings. So that's just the 1 year outcome, but the average life of a measure that we implement is usually 15 years. So, year over year, these projects will continue to save that amount. And as the grid decarbonizes anywhere that we help to move to an electric fuel source, the greenhouse gas impact will actually, the reduction will actually become greater. So I work at a networking and economic development organization. So I'm also really excited about kind of the economic case for small business energy efficiency. I mentioned the local multiplier effect, and that's an effect that has been studied a lot, and there's some statistics to throw out, but it's the idea that there's an additional economic benefit to spending money in the local economy. And one of the numbers we like to talk about is when you spend $100 at a local business, 43 of those dollars tend to recirculate in the local economy. So it's going to, your favorite restaurant, your favorite mechanic, helping create a more thriving community where you live. And another cool thing about our program is that with our grant funding, we're able to provide financial incentives and rebates to businesses to help them make improvements through energy efficiency retrofits. And kind of the mechanism there, what we tend to see is either they come to us with a project that they already have in mind, and we're able to use our incentives either to bring it up to a higher tier of efficiency, or maybe expand the scope to add on some other projects that they wouldn't otherwise be able to afford. Or in other cases, we perform the energy audit and make them aware of an opportunity they weren't previously thinking about. And then we're able to use our incentives to make the economic case to complete that upgrade. So, having the incentives really helps us move these projects forward. And looking at this, for every dollar of our community energy challenge incentives, we're usually able to help them get around $2.50 of utility rebates. And this doesn't even include other grant programs and rebate programs, which are a little less common, but there's a lot out there as well. And we found through bringing this incentive money to the table, we're able to help them invest $25 of their own money for every dollar that we put in, and make a project that between the incentives and the projected energy savings, feels like a win for that business. And I wanted to share this. I spoke with Dan Dunn, the owner of CAS Energy Services. This was about 6 years ago. And he had just started CAS Energy Services around the time that the recession began, and really credited the work created through the Community Energy Challenge in those early days with helping keep his small business afloat. And he was expressing that he was excited that they were able to hire full-time employees and offer benefits to them, and that they were able to spend about half of their business expenses within Whatcom County where they're located. So he's aware of that local multiplier effect as well. So this was a great feel-good story about the impact of the program. But the really cool thing is, now about 6 years later, they've greatly expanded their staff. They're still growing strong. And they also recently acquired a local electrical business as well as a local plumbing business. So they're really thriving, and it feels good to have been able to play a part in them getting over that difficult time in 2008. So again, I could talk about kind of how we approach working with small businesses for a lot longer than one slide, but just wanted to share a few key takeaways. A lot of the time when you're working with small, medium-sized businesses, you're working directly with the owner or someone close to it. They're busy and they're wearing a lot of hats. Many of them do have facilities managers, which is, I love working with facilities managers because they're really the expert on their building, and it puts us more in the role of just helping bring all the different resources and options to the table. But in a lot of cases, we are serving that role for the business. So it's up to us to get to know the building in maybe a way that the owner doesn't from their point of view, and help make smart recommendations. And in either case, the businesses are, really interested in unbiased advice. Just if they're working with us, they've definitely expressed the value that they want to save energy. But beyond that, they want to know what's a smart investment and what will have a real impact. And so, I mentioned a big part of what we do is helping bring resources to bear on these projects. There's all sorts of rebate and grant programs. We don't try to reinvent the wheel. We just try to be knowledgeable so that people are aware of all the options that they have. It's really common for us to help businesses apply for utility rebates. The only time when there's usually not something available is when a project is too small, or fuel switching. So with those electrification projects, unfortunately, usually we are the only source of rebates for those, but makes it all the more important to involve us in those processes. Opalco, the electric utility in the San Juan Islands, does have some incentives for electrification, though, for their clients. So that's nice. PSE has a great program, their Commercial Strategic Energy Management Program, which helps fund and resource energy manager position at large businesses, I believe over 1 million square feet. We participated in that program for a while, and the way we did that was we actually put together a portfolio of 70 of our business participants that in aggregate they met this minimum square footage requirement, and that let us bring the education and resources of the CSEM program to those businesses in a way that large businesses have access to. So that felt really cool, and looking forward to participating in that again in the future. And lately, we've been working more with the USDA. They have many programs for rural businesses geared around economic development and energy efficiency. And in our service territory, which is Whatcom, Skagit, San Juan, and Island counties, anything outside of the incorporated cities of Bellingham or Ferndale are considered rural. So those are additional resources that we've been leveraging. And our organization, the Community Energy Challenge, is a partnership at its very core between Sustainable Connections and Opportunity Council. So we love a good partnership. And last year we ran 2 campaigns, Solarize and Energize, working with Spark Northwest, USDA. For Energize campaign, we partnered with Opalco in the San Juan Islands and several local solar installers. And we conducted energy and solar audits at 58 businesses with the goal of helping them apply for REAP grants from the USDA to bring a big funding source for larger energy efficiency retrofits and solar arrays. And that's still very much in progress. We have a lot of businesses in the program waiting to hear back about their grants. But in the meantime, the great thing about working with all those businesses is everyone that we had a touch at, we also had the opportunity to provide LED lighting, to look at their thermostat settings, and just help them tune up and become more efficient on the ground in the first place. So just a little note about the future to wrap up. As I mentioned, our program began with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act and the Community Energy Efficiency Pilot Program funding through WSU, with the goal of creating jobs and piloting new approaches to energy efficiency. And so, that continues to be our goal going forward. we're sort of born out of a recession, and unfortunately, we find ourselves in one again. We hope to play an active role in recovery from this recession, helping people make their buildings more comfortable and durable, and help lower operating costs. And we've also seen an uptick in interest in indoor air quality. So hoping to be able to come to the table on that conversation and make sure that energy efficiency is considered as people are making um, investments in improved ventilation and air quality technologies. So, and I also hope as future stimulus efforts come out that there's more of a focus on small commercial energy efficiency. I hope I've shown that with our small program, we've really been able to make an impact with the businesses that we've worked with on multiple levels. And I'd love to see program replication throughout the state and in other areas.
Oh, sorry about that. I knew I kept myself on mute. So if you know me, as I hope some of you in the audience do, you're not surprised by that at all. So thank you, Emily, for that really interesting discussion of the small business work that you're doing. It's such an important part of the energy efficiency pie, as you discussed early in your presentation. We're now going to take some questions from the audience. And our first question is, are there any other similar programs in Washington?
Yeah, thanks. So there's I would say there's not any exact kindred spirit or kind of sister program with the Community Energy Challenge. We're pretty comprehensive, but early on in our life cycle, the original funding that we received through ARA and the Community Energy Efficiency Pilot programs, there was a pretty robust commercial program in Thurston County. I believe they focused on a lot of lighting retrofits at the time. And other organizations that received some of that funding focused on commercial as well. I know Snohomish PUD had good offerings for businesses for a while. But really, that initial funding was focused way more heavily around residential weatherization. Actually, before I worked at the Community Energy Challenge, I worked on low-income weatherization through some of that same funding. So that was really where the big push happened. But through my work in this sector, feeling really thankful for that start we got from that initial funding. I'm hoping that maybe the next generation of this program going forward, we can see more replication around the state.
Okay. We have another question. How are you funded? Can you talk a bit more about your funding?
Yeah, currently we are still funded through WSU. They're the ones who ran the Community Energy Efficiency Pilot Program that we kind of formulated under. We still receive a small slice of their pie for jobs creation money, and then we also receive some funding through Northwest Clean Air Agency. And at various times, like I mentioned, that Energize campaign. We'll do a more limited campaign through specific grants. So that was for a specific project, but we received that grant money through the USDA. So any of you work in nonprofits, you know, you're kind of always looking for those opportunities and angles to be able to deliver your services.
Okay. Let's see. Another question here. This is kind of a long one. Is making a case of a real economic benefit for a typical energy efficiency project difficult? How do you convince the client to go forward with the required investment, and what measures do you use, like future value, return on investment, present value, etc.?
That is such a good question. And that's one of the reasons why I think having sort of this program where you have the dedicated energy auditors who are a third party, we aren't salespeople for the project that we're trying to get them to do. A big part of what we do is we listen to what their values are. Why are they considering it? Why did they have an energy audit in the first place? part of the good thing is if people have us out there, they at least share our values around energy efficiency. It could be, in their case, for economic reasons, or it could be for environmental reasons. Could just be they like the technology, it's cool. It's gonna meet their needs better. So we really tease that out. Then after we do our energy audit, and we get the information about what they want to do, get some contractor bids, we usually put together a report. Our standard report will usually look at things like just simple payback based on energy savings, available rebates on the table. But a lot of the time, after we have that conversation, there could be additional analysis. Like I just did one where for a church where they were really focused on carbon footprint reduction, and so it was a more nuanced conversation around the carbon intensity of the grid, how it's going to change over time, electrification, looking at different measures from that standpoint. So again, it's nice to be able to have that close relationship and really tailor it to the client.
Okay. Another question from the audience. What would it take to expand similar services to more business communities?
I wish I had a super great answer that I already implemented and could tell you that it worked. I think the biggest barrier to expanding these sorts of services is just limited funding and prioritizing. So many things in our society, so many services, all the way down to things that we're kind of working to offset, like the oil industry, are subsidized. So it's really about what are we as a society supporting based on our value system. And there's just really limited funding for these sort of nonprofit programs. But seen lots of cool mechanisms, things like revolving loan funds. Earlier we were talking about kind of co-op situation for conservation funding. I'd love to just, on more of the relationship side, love to just see program replication. If one of the barriers is just how to get started, we have this decade of experience that we could help pass on. We'd love to see similar programs in other areas. So I don't have a pat answer for that, but I think a combination of prioritizing the small business sector, which, as we're seeing right now, is really struggling, and this sort of work is one way to support that sector among many, and then finding where that expertise already exists with programs like ours and utilities and other entities to, so people don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Okay. We have another question from the audience. Do you make a living doing this?
Yeah. Sometimes, sometimes when people hear that I work at a nonprofit, like our clients, they're like, if you don't make a profit, how do you get paid? It's just a different mechanism. It's nonprofits usually grant funded. We do bring in some money. There's a small charge for the energy audit. And I think maybe the real thrust behind this question, or at least my uncle grilled me on this once, is if what you're doing is so good, why aren't people paying thousands and thousands of dollars for it? And again, I think it kind of comes back to what we value as a society. And the truth is, like, for large businesses, you can have a very profitable business serving, like large ESCOs, kind of these big corporate efforts to focus on larger energy efficiency projects. So for the small business sector at this time, they are able to pay us to do this. A smaller amount doesn't pay my whole salary, and then we leverage grant funding so that we can do things like offer incentives and keep making a living wage and keep doing this work.
Our last question. I've really enjoyed your presentation today, and I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, Jeff Thiel of Carbon Innovations. Jeff formed Carbon Innovations to support market-based solutions to the global climate crisis, and he's going to be talking with us today about accelerating a decarbonized economy. So welcome, Jeff.
Good morning. I'm Jeff Thiel with Carbon Innovations. We are a collection of seasoned professionals who are working to promote solutions to the global warming crisis. Hey, thanks for inviting me to join you today. It's really great that you all are working to increase the energy efficiency of America. That's a critical part of the solution to the global warming crisis. So today I'm going to talk to you about a policy proposal that will harness the power of price signals to accelerate the necessary transition to a thriving global economy that will have no carbon pollution, and by doing that, will preserve a livable world for future generations. To start, I want to make sure that we all have a shared understanding of how critical it is that we act quickly and boldly to address the global warming crisis. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've been dumping more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year, where it stays for over a century. Now, let me help you visualize your impact here. So, a metric ton of carbon dioxide fills a sphere that's 10 meters in diameter, or just a little over 33 feet across. So we've dumped 1.6 trillion spheres into the atmosphere in the past 130 years. And during that time, the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased 43%. So what's going to happen next? Well, to date, the progression has been mainly driven by human activity. We can stop that progression if we stop burning fossil fuels. But if we don't act quickly, we may no longer be able to stop global warming. There are multiple feedback loops that are coming into play that will accelerate the increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. So for example, by melting snow and ice cover, we're replacing a reflective surface with a heat absorbing surface. And then in our oceans, warmer water can't absorb as much gas as cold water can. So warmer oceans will result in more gas being retained in the atmosphere and a lot more warm water vapor, which is a potent greenhouse gas. The death of tropical and boreal forests due to increasing temperature, drought, and disease is going to result in less carbon matter being retained by plants and more being released into the atmosphere through plant decomposition. Finally, there are massive amounts of organic matter that are frozen in permafrost. And if those organic matters start to decompose as permafrost melts, it will release vast quantities of methane and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, enough to potentially double the quantity of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So all of these feedback loops amplify the global warming process. While there are some feedback loops that diminish it and slow the progression, they're relatively small in comparison. So this reality is totally depressing if, like me, you care about leaving a livable world for future generations. Fortunately, we have all the tools we need now to avert a climate catastrophe. Renewable energy is now cheaper than fossil fuel energy used to generate electricity. And people like you have the know-how to help us use energy a lot more efficiently. So what we need now are bold policy ideas that can reduce emissions at the scale that's needed to avert catastrophic climate change. So I'm excited to be here today to talk to you about a critical policy that's absolutely necessary if we're going to eliminate greenhouse gas pollution from our economy in time to ensure a livable world for future generations. The carbon fee and dividend policy has been introduced into the US House of Representatives as HR 763, or House Resolution 763, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. It represents a big, bold, bipartisan solution to the global warming crisis. So I'm confident that the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act will drive down America's carbon pollution and bring climate change under control while unleashing American innovation and ingenuity in ways that will deliver solutions that make us all better off. So here's how this policy works. The structure is pretty easy to understand. There are two essential mechanisms. So the first mechanism is the fees on fossil fuels. Significant and rising fees will be levied where fossil fuels enter the economy. So I'm talking about ports, wellheads, pipelines. It's a pretty straightforward administrative process to collect these fees for the emissions that are associated with the fossil fuels that companies are either selling as energy or as feedstocks for manufacturing. The second mechanism is the dividends that get paid to American households. All the money collected from the carbon pollution fees will be distributed back to American people to spend as they see fit. So the administrative costs of this process are expected to be about 2%. Now, the legislation has a couple of additional provisions that make the policy work in today's political environment. First of all, to protect American manufacturers and American jobs, emissions-intensive imported goods will be levied fees at the border. I'm talking about things like not just fuels, but cement, steel, aluminum, glass, and certain chemicals. Goods exported from the US in those categories, in contrast, will receive a refund of the fees that were levied under this policy. The policy also preserves effective current regulations like auto mileage standards, but it pauses the authority of the EPA to enact new regulations on carbon dioxide and equivalent emissions that are covered by the fees for the first 10 years. If during that period the emission targets are not being met, Congress gives clear direction to the EPA to regulate emissions to meet the targets. The pause doesn't affect EPA action related to things like clean water, clean air, health, and other issues. Now, eventually, the fees will dwindle as the emissions targets are achieved, at which time, when it reaches a low level, the system will be dismantled. So this legislation has a built-in sunset clause. So the benefits of this policy will be numerous. I'd like to talk about them in turn. First of all, it'll be effective. Economists agree that the most efficient way to reduce emissions pollution, carbon pollution, is to levy fees on carbon pollution. It makes sense that this policy will drive down carbon and pollution in our economy because energy companies, industry, households will all have incentives to move towards cleaner, cheaper options as prices increase. Now, the fees start out low at $15 per metric ton, and they increase steadily over time. They may peak at about $115 per ton, which gives businesses a lot of time to predict how things are going to change and plan their move to lower carbon alternatives for the goods and services that they create or consume. Now, there have been many studies that have modeled the impact of carbon fees on the level of emissions coming out of our economy. And the studies have concluded that emissions would be reduced 40% in 10 years from a policy like this, and by 90% over the first 30 years. So those emission reductions are in line with what we need to accomplish for the planet to avert catastrophic levels of climate change. In fact, they even go beyond what would be achieved by the climate accords. So for that reason, this is a very effective policy. Now, this policy will also be good for people. It's designed in a way that protects lower income households while preserving the option for everyone to choose how they respond to the higher prices we'll see as the prices start to reflect the true costs of the pollution that's caused by burning fossil fuels. So the dividends that families receive would initially amount to hundreds of dollars per year, and would, at their peak, reach over $4,000 per year. So assume for a moment that all the fees that are levied are passed by producers on to consumers in the form of higher prices, which won't necessarily happen. It depends on how competitive those industries are. But if we assume that, and we think about the median household, their income would not change. The dividends that they receive would offset any price increases they would see. Now, in general, lower income households tend to have lower carbon footprints. So lower income households will typically receive more in dividends than they would pay in the form of higher fees or higher prices on goods and services. In contrast, higher income households have higher carbon footprints because they use more energy and they spend more on goods and services. So higher income households would typically pay more in higher prices than they'd receive in dividends. So this policy will also affect people in some other very beneficial ways. Think about for a moment the impact of a healthier environment due to better air quality. So we know that poor air quality affects many people, but especially people in low-income families who live closer to sources of air pollution. Children growing up with poor air quality are much more likely to contract respiratory illnesses like asthma. And older people in those locations are more likely to develop illnesses like COPD and to have a weakened immune system that can cause them to be more vulnerable to infections and disease. So medical experts at places like the National Academy of Sciences calculated that over 100,000 people die every year in the United States due to the impacts of poor air quality. Now, think about it for a moment. That's as many as have died during the pandemic, and that's happening every year. Treating the health problems that these people face from poor air quality is also costing our economy hundreds of billions of dollars a year in direct healthcare spending, and that money would be freed up to use for better purposes. So over the first 10 years of this policy, analysts project that hundreds of thousands of lives would be saved, and many people will experience lower health costs and better health. So I expect you're all aware that there are many more jobs that are being created every year in the renewable energy industry than there are in the fossil fuel industry. And you know that even more jobs will be created if we increase our investment in energy efficiency. So you all work in one of the fields that's going to experience high growth as we transition to a future that's free of carbon pollution. Now, the costs of carbon pollution are already a large and growing drag on our economy. Economic losses from things like extreme weather events, health damages to air pollution are already costing the U.S. Economy over $240 billion per year. And that number is only going to increase in the future if we don't move quickly to eliminate carbon pollution. The costs that we avoid can be invested in growing our economy and creating jobs. The fees on emissions will definitely spur investments in clean energy and energy efficiency. And in the course of doing that, they're going to produce a lot more jobs than would be produced if we continue to use fossil fuels. Studies have projected that over 2.1 million jobs will be created by this policy in the first 10 years. So we simply can't afford not to invest in clean energy and energy efficiency rather than fossil fuels. The Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act has been designed in a way that will make it revenue neutral. The fees get placed in a trust, and they're not available then for the federal government to spend as part of its general budget needs. That's why this policy won't grow the size of the federal government. So why is it important to have a policy that's revenue neutral? Why not have the government decide how to spend the fees instead of households? Well, I assert that it's simply not possible for a few government officials to make optimal decisions about how millions of businesses and consumers need to manage their spending in our complex economy. Instead, we need to send the right price signals to consumers and businesses so that they have the incentives to reduce carbon pollution in the many economic decisions that they make every day. So we need to put the wisdom of the crowd to work to cut our emissions. Now, you're probably aware that 70% of our economy is driven by consumer spending. So putting the dividend cash into the hands of American taxpayers is going to stimulate a lot of climate smart decisions, all the way from the individual corner store up to the executive boardroom. Now, we're also going to need to make a lot of investments to scale up a lot of the solutions that we have. And some of those investments are going to be large and risky. I think we're going to get better results if those investments are made through coordinated action of government and the private sector. Venture capital firms, banks, entrepreneurs, if they see a predictable price signal and supportive government policy for reducing emissions, they're going to innovate to create solutions and breakthroughs that we haven't even dreamed of yet. Now, the revenue neutral nature of the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act is what makes it possible to build bipartisan support. It's critical that we have bipartisan support to make the law durable over time. What we want to avoid is a situation like we have with the Affordable Care Act today, where the act was passed by the Democrats on party lines, and then as soon as a Republican administration came into office, they've been trying to undo it. So after hearing about these benefits, it should come as no surprise that this policy has developed widespread and growing support. I'm excited to announce that there are over 80 House co-sponsors now for House Resolution 763. That's a pretty large number, and approaching the point where it needs to be addressed in committee. We have over 3,500 economists who signed a letter in support of carbon pollution fees, including 27 Nobel laureates and 14 former leaders of the Federal Reserve Bank. There are Republican elder statesmen who are working to support the bill, including people like Howard Baker, George Shultz, Henry Paulson, and Martin Feldstein. And major corporations have lined up behind it, including even ExxonMobil, BP, and Shell. There are hundreds of cities who've passed municipal resolutions in support of the bill, and over 1,500 statements of support from faith groups, community groups, nonprofits, and business associations. Finally, and most importantly, there's a lot of support amongst voters. A majority of Republican voters, and over 75% of Republicans under the age of 40, support a carbon fee and dividend policy when it's explained to them. This is based on Republican polling data. So now hopefully I've convinced you to be a supporter as well. So let's recap what we've learned, and then I'll take questions. The Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act places significant fees on fossil fuel emissions and returns all of those fees to households. It's going to be effective. It will reduce our emissions in the US economy by over 40% in 10 years. It's good for people. It'll improve their health and put money in their pocketbook that they can use to spend and stimulate the economy. It's good for the economy in that it'll create more jobs. It's estimated will create 2.1 million jobs in 10 years with this policy. It's bipartisan. It's got support from a majority of both Republican and Democratic voters. And it's revenue neutral. The fees will all be returned to households, so it won't grow the size of the federal government. So thank you for the time today, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thanks, Jeff. That was a very interesting discussion. Obviously, the importance of your work couldn't be overstated. We're going to take some questions from the audience. The first question, It's a bit of a long one. Could you explain how the carbon fees would be assessed? Would the fee be based on the average carbon footprint for a specific type of product? Or would it vary by manufacturer based on the actions they are already doing to lower their carbon footprint, such as on-site efficiency, CCS, and procurement of renewable electricity?
Yeah, so the way that the fees would be calculated would be based on the physics of the fossil fuel that we're talking about. So if it's coal or gas or oil, we first measure where it's coming into the economy, measure the quantity that's being brought into the economy, and then for each type of fossil fuel, there's a carbon emissions intensity associated with burning that fossil fuel. So you just do that arithmetic of quantity times intensity to get the total impact, and then the price, per metric ton of the emissions that would be associated with that. So that's how the fees are established.
Okay. Next question. The tariffs are a critical part of this policy. We are trying something similar in Canada without the tariffs and are seeing protests from price-taking industries like agriculture. How plausible is it that the tariffs would be enacted?
Well, they're built right into the bill. So the bill doesn't, offer up the option of putting in place a border adjustment mechanism. It makes that part of the policy itself. So if the policy is enacted, the border adjustment mechanism will come with it. Now, the rulemaking associated with exactly how that works is going to be partially left up to the administering authorities because they're going to be more informed about the details of how they're going to make it work. But it's not optional in this bill.
Okay. Next question. What can I do as an individual to help support the adoption of this legislation? Right, my congresspeople?
Yes. Yes, that is one of the best things you can do. Call them is even better. And then if you want to join with other like-minded people who are also working to advocate for a carbon fee and dividend policy, not just in the US, but in other places like Canada, you can join the Citizens Climate Lobby. So if you just go look up Citizens Climate Lobby online, you'll learn more about that organization. It's got a very positive, nonpartisan approach to its work with our members of Congress, and it also brings together people who are, sharing in that work together, which makes it more enjoyable and makes it easier to keep it up over time. So that's what I recommend.
Okay, and another question, Congress oriented. Are there any congresspersons in Washington that do not support this one yet?
Okay, in the state of Washington, of our 6 or 7, 2 have signed on as co-sponsors. So there's levels of support, right? I mean, I think all our Congress people, if this bill were brought to the floor for a vote, would vote for it. But there are several who've already co-sponsored it, including Denny Heck and Derek Kilmer.
Okay, next question. So what about manufacturers that make products that use or emit carbon? Who is responsible for the tax on these goods?
Okay, so if we're talking about goods that are created with a fossil fuel as a feedstock or as an input to the manufacturing process, then the buyer of that fuel is going to see higher prices, depending again on the competitive intensity of the industry. It could also profit margins for the sellers of the fuel could be reduced as well. So if they see higher prices for that, then they have to make a decision about what to do with that. They could change the way they make their products. They could pass those on in the form of higher prices. Our expectation is it'll create competitive pressure for them to seek out alternatives, improve their manufacturing processes so they use less of those inputs, and therefore not have to raise prices to consumers.
Okay, this next one is pretty similar. Who pays the fees? Is it fuel suppliers or fuel consumers or what?
Yeah, so it's being paid by the fuel supplier. So it's capturing it, as close to the source as we can. I think the initial scoping of the administrative work that'd be required to do this estimated there's about 14,000 points in the economy where there's a well or a pipeline or a port where fossil fuels are being brought into the economy, and that's where there are already various jurisdictions levying fees for various purposes, and this would just be would supplement that additional revenue and then be collected centrally.
Okay, another question from the audience. Washington State voted down a revenue neutral carbon tax in 2016 by a pretty wide margin. What do you feel went wrong with that campaign?
Yeah, that was, I think you're referring to what we saw on the ballot as an initiative, I-732 in 2016. And that particular campaign, I think the biggest problem with it was that the whole community of environmental and progressive organizations in the state of Washington did not get together with the authors of the initiative and really support it in a collaborative way. So they weren't unified in their support of it. And I think the other challenge there is that it's hard to levy this kind of an approach on a small area without having what they call leakage, where purchasers try to go around that area to acquire the goods and avoid the taxes. So there are some inherent challenges with doing it where you have smaller borders involved, like at the state level.
Okay, next question. Is there any type of plan to use these fees and reinvest them for new renewable energy system installation?
Yeah, so remember there are two mechanisms. There's the collection of the fees, but then there's the redistribution of the fees to households. And the power of this approach is in the household, business, industry decision making every day about how to respond to the higher prices they see on fossil fuels. So the fees aren't collected and decisions made about how to use it by the government. They're decided by you and me every day when we go to the pump, which, for gas, to get gas, which is probably the most obvious example. But even in the choices of some goods we purchase that may have fossil fuels as a feedstock, when we see higher prices for those, we shift away from them and seek ones that are lower prices. It can involve decisions you make too in your household about using electricity as a fuel to heat and cool your home rather than natural gas, or switching to an electric vehicle. So exactly how it's used is a responsibility of the household to decide. And I think that's the right place for that decision making. Only they know best about what they need.
Okay, and another question. How do you prevent job losses when the cost of manufacturing increases dramatically?
Well, in fact, some goods increase in costs to be manufactured and others decrease on a relative basis. And so there isn't a net loss of jobs in this. In fact, it will stimulate investment in technologies like solar and wind and energy efficiency in homes and businesses that we know support many more jobs than huge oil refineries which may have a small number of people in a control room sort of monitoring it on a regular basis. So in fact, the number of jobs will actually increase, not go down, as a result of this kind of a policy.
Okay, well, I think that was our last question, Jeff. So thank you so much for your time today. It was really interesting to hear from you. I'm going to introduce our next speakers. We have two this time: Seth McKinney from Stillwater Energy and Amy Larrabee from Tacoma Public Utilities, who will be speaking with us today about Energy Star Portfolio Manager. Welcome.
Thank you, Carrie. Thanks for the introduction. I'm Seth McKinney. I'm a strategic energy management coach with Stillwater Energy. I was the resource conservation manager, which is a regional term. Some people more nationally would call it energy manager at Pierce County for a number of years. I worked with Ann Larrabee, who is also presenting with me today. She was with the utility and Tacoma Power and we worked together on energy data, specifically on our topic today, which is getting started with Portfolio Manager. Hi, Ann.
Hi, Seth. Thank you. I'm Ann Larrabee. I'm the Conservation Data Manager at Tacoma Public Utilities.
And the main purpose of today is to invite everyone to really think together about why and whether Portfolio Manager could be an essential part of your energy management program. And if you're already using it, awesome. Let's try to think together about whether and how you can expand on that use. We're going to do mostly high-level overview today, but we'll have a chance for questions at the end, and we can dive a little more deeply if we need to. Okay, so what is it? Portfolio Manager is, first and foremost, it's a free tool offered by the US EPA. And it's a partnership between the Department of Energy and the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. Like I said, it's a free tool that helps, in my opinion, do the part of energy management that no one really likes to do, which is the data management side of things. And you can do all of these things listed here on the screen, and you can do it for every single building in your portfolio. The way I like to look at it, when I was an energy manager, I like to think of it as like a secret X-ray vision device for my buildings. I can get really detailed down to the meter level to see, for electricity use, for example, to see the kilowatt hours consumed per month by bill, see demand. You can zoom out a little bit to see trends over the year for a particular building. Zoom out a little more. Almost like Google Maps or Google Earth to get that portfolio level view of the trends for the whole portfolio. In this case, when I was using it at Pierce County, we were managing over 50 sites, over 70 buildings, 8 different electricity utilities, 1 major gas utility, and I believe another 8 different water utilities, all managed within Portfolio Manager. So one of the key aspects of strategic energy management, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a strategic energy management coach. It's a continuous improvement process that helps to build a culture of energy management within an organization. One of the key tenets of SEM are the 3 A's of energy data: acquire, analyze, and act. One of the things that Portfolio Manager can do for you, one of the most important things to do that it does, is allow you to do almost all of the key bullet points within acquire, analyze, and act, except for these here that are very, very unique to your organization. There we go. Obviously, we can't help you identify the ownership of the data within your organization. You can't help determine data format. It can't help you determine the procedures from getting it from the people who own the data into a format that's acceptable for Portfolio Manager, but it can help you to, once you do have the data, to organize it really succinctly, clean the data, and then analyze it and report out, all in the service of action, which is really the point of any energy management program, is to collect data about your buildings, collect energy data about your buildings, analyze it, report out, understand, tell a story with that data, and then act on it. I'm going to hand it over to Ann for just a couple of slides here.
Thank you, Seth. I'm stealing that first A from him because my part of the presentation is about acquiring the data. So as a utility representative, I'm going to go through a little bit of the things that you'll want to know before you start building that connection with your utility. The big disclaimer here is that all utilities are different. We have different ways of storing our data. We have different databases. We have different business processes. So it will be important to get a basic understanding of how your utility handles the data so that when you go to the analysis side, you actually have more information about what the data is looking like. Additionally, the utilities have different exchange structures. You can get your data automatically through Portfolio Manager, which I'll touch on the next slide, but also you can get it manually. And so that will depend on your utility. Lastly, a difference that can happen is that a handful of utilities have hired third parties to help them manage this process of getting data from the utility to the into Portfolio Manager. So that's just another variable that I want you guys to be aware of. So let's dive into this high-level overview about acquiring data from your utility. Like I foreshadowed just a second ago, there are two different ways to do that. You have the manual data exchange and the automatic data exchange. Manual is literally emailing or dropping on a Dropbox or FTP server Excel files that the client or whoever your building manager is can then copy and paste into Portfolio Manager's templates and upload. The automatic data exchange is when the utility has worked directly with Energy Star to create an API that sends the data right from the utility right into Portfolio Manager. At Tacoma Power, we actually have a blend of both, and I would not be surprised if a lot of utilities did. The difference for us is that simple buildings that just have one account, one meter, there's not any tenants, there's not a bunch of sub-metering. That's super simple for the automatic data exchange. As soon as things start to get complex, like you've got tenants going on, or you have sub-meters or pieces of the building have been added on post the original construction, that's when things start to get a little bit needing a human eye on it. So getting into your data with the utility, there are a few things I would really encourage you to ask your utility. First of all, what are the privacy regulations? In Washington state, I'm actually legally allowed to send aggregate consumption data if there are 4 or more tenants in the building, but that might not be the case for every state. If there's 3 or more tenants, the building owner actually has to get a waiver signed by each individual tenant before I can provide the data. Knowing that ahead of time before you reach out hoping to get your consumption information will save you a lot of time. Additionally, many utilities are going to have their own privacy waivers that they'll want your tenants to sign. So getting in front of that will make this process way more efficient. Next, their data refresh cycle. This is going to have a huge impact on the shape of your curve and how often you can get in there and do some analysis. At Tacoma Power right now, most of our buildings are metered every other month, with a handful being metered every month. So this is going to have a big implication on the frequency of data that you're getting. Next, what kind of meter does the utility use? Right now at Tacoma Power, we use the meters that are completely manual. A human being has to drive to the meter and look at it. And so that is going to create some discrepancies in when the meter read date and when the billing cycle, where it adds some fuzziness. I'm proud to say we're moving to a smart meter infrastructure where the utility meter will actually send us data all on its own without a human having to go over there, and it'll be in intervals of 15 minutes as opposed to 30 or 60 days. So that's a huge difference. And knowing if your utility with your consumption data, which one they have, will really inform your analysis once you get your hands on your data. Lastly, having a good understanding of your building and how it's metered is not a must-have, but it can be super helpful. At Tacoma Power, people are contacting me for their consumption data, and I'm not a building engineer, I'm a data manager. And so being able to tell me what the structure of your building is like is very helpful. Your utility should be able to research in their database what that is, but as much as you can create this partnership with the utility, the much smoother you'll get your consumption data and the more accurate it will be. So that's a little bit of the perspective from the utility side. I am now going to pass the spotlight back to Seth, who is going to continue the conversation from the other side of the coin.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I couldn't agree more about what Anne was saying about relationships. As I mentioned earlier, I was the energy manager at Pierce County, which is Tacoma's county. I'm not sure if I mentioned that earlier, which is where Tacoma Power is located, as you might imagine. And having to quote unquote deal with over or at least 8 utilities and energy and at least 8 utilities with water, having personal relationships at each one of the utilities was essential for managing my data, managing the data, I should say, and getting it efficiently into Portfolio Manager. I'm going to take a quick moment and take that X-ray vision point of view that I mentioned earlier, and we're going to look at one building that I'm familiar with and give you a sense of when you finally do get that data from the utility, you get a few years in there, or even a few months. Ideally, you get at least 24 months of utility data in there. And for this, you know, since we're energy efficiency folks here, ideally energy data, you're gonna get a trend, and it's gonna look like this. You have a few options for what type of metrics that you can use when you're looking at when you have this high level dashboard. This is your most basic dashboard within Portfolio Manager. And in this case, I've selected weather normalized site EUI. And what this tells you is that at the site level, it's going to give you the energy use intensity. And in the US, as you likely know, we use kBTU per square foot. We do that because it's easier to convert kilowatt hours and therms or any other gas utility to a single metric. And like I said, once you have that data in Portfolio Manager, you start to see a trend. In this case, we see that over the 10 years that this building was collecting data, or in the last 10 years, energy use didn't really change until about, right around 20, what do we see here? Let me try to make this larger, 2015, and then it starts to dip down. Now, without context, this energy data doesn't really tell you that much. But if you can take some notes about your data, you can actually do that within Portfolio Manager itself. You still need some institutional knowledge to tell the story about the data, but you have a record of what was happening. I personally know that this building was lowering occupancy over a few years until it was basically empty in 2016, but it was still using a lot of energy in 2016. And then there was a tenant improvement, a big remodel, and then it was at full occupancy again. And you can see that over that period, between essentially 2009 to 2019, there really wasn't a whole lot of change in energy use. We did see an increase in energy efficiency, and you see at the top part of this box here, which is again your main dashboard in a building within Portfolio Manager. This shows your Energy Star score. Now, an Energy Star score is an index based on your building type that is indexed to an Energy Star score of 50 is the median for that building type across the country. So what can we tell about this building right away is that while it did improve its energy efficiency over the 10 years shown here, it did start pretty poorly in the 4th percentile and it ended up in what is the 15th percentile now. What else do we notice here? We notice that the energy efficiency did improve. We can see that in kBTUs, but the energy cost went up quite a bit over the same time. So even though energy efficiency improved, energy costs went up quite a bit. So a couple of things that most people don't actually know about Portfolio Manager is that right here on the top level dashboard and for the whole portfolio level as well, you can report out for an individual building its carbon use.
Well, thank you. That was an interesting discussion of Portfolio Manager. We talk about that a lot in the energy efficiency world. And here in Washington, I think it's increasingly becoming more important for building owners and managers as we prepare for the implementation of the Clean Buildings Act. We're going to take some questions from the audience. The first question, it sounds like someone is just interested in hearing a little bit more of your knowledge of Portfolio Manager, maybe how you're using it.
I appreciate the open-ended question there. It looks like we had a little bit of a technical difficulty there for a moment. What I was saying is that the top level dashboard of Energy Star Portfolio Manager actually allows you to track your carbon use over time, or your essentially your carbon intensity in your building. And so, in terms of expanding on my knowledge of Portfolio Manager, I think one of the things that I think that surprises folks the most is that you can use Portfolio Manager to track carbon not only at the building level, at the individual site level, but also across your portfolio as well. So It's an enormously detailed tool. There are custom level reports. You can enter not only can you create your own reports, but you can use the reports that are already available to you. I highly encourage you to log on to the Portfolio Manager website and just start digging.
Okay. Another question from the audience. How do you take into account differential energy consumption in multi-tenant buildings when performing benchmarking analysis?
Okay, so how do you take into account differential energy consumption in multi-tenant buildings when performing benchmarking analysis? That is a big question. I think I understand it here. Got it. Yeah. So the best thing to do, from my perspective, is if a building has multiple meters, if there are multiple accounts on a single meter, or if there are multiple meters for multiple accounts, that does become difficult. The strength in Portfolio Manager, what this question I think is getting at, and I think where the strength of Portfolio Manager, where it can shine, is at the building level. And so differentiating tenants you would really need to submeter. And you can then separate out each one of those submetering sites as an individual site within Portfolio Manager if you would like to do that. But again, the power in Portfolio Manager is at the building level. You can, if you are a building owner, if you're the building owner, using Portfolio Manager to look at the individual meter level is helpful. But in terms of separating out tenant use, which is where I think this question is going, that is only really valuable if you're either submetering your data per tenant or each tenant has its own meter.
Okay. So we'll see if there's any more questions coming in from the audience,
Yeah.
but in the meantime,
Sure.
I can throw a couple at you guys.
Yeah, sounds good.
So in terms of tools that you use when you're trying to make the case for improvements or upgrades inside your facility, do you think Portfolio Manager is the kind of tool that can help support a facility manager when they're trying to make the case for a capital improvement project or other efficiency projects?
Absolutely. Outside of a energy model, Portfolio Manager does all of the work for benchmarking. And so once you have a baseline of your energy use, you can either demonstrate based on your projected energy savings what your cost savings will be for a particular project, or you can retrospectively look at projects that you've done in the past and say, look, this is the weather normalized change in energy efficiency. So absolutely.
Okay. Another question from the audience. Do you know if there is an initiative to standardize the request and share of data for all utilities? Is the green button part of this?
That's a great question. Anne, do you have?
Yeah, I can speak on that one. I personally am not aware of any initiatives that would standardize it. I think we're in a super interesting moment right now where you have these utilities that have been in business for hundreds of years. Stuff was on paper before. And now we have this newish tool, and in Washington State, we're all being required to start using it. And so standardizing our way we get requests and send out data is something that we're just trying to figure out right now how to send out our own Tacoma Power data, let alone try to coordinate with Lakewood Power and Puget Sound Energy and Seattle City Light. But that is definitely something that should be a part of the long-term roadmap. Now, as far as the green button part of the question, I have no idea what you're talking about.
So I can speak to the green button a little bit. I can speak to green button just a little bit. I know it was an initiative that was picked up by Energy Star a number of years ago. and some utilities do allow for a single download of your energy data. It is not widely adopted yet. It is a standard for energy data transfer that I think is built on the beads protocol, but that's getting into a little too much details, I think, at this point.
Okay, another question from the audience. When you're trying to split the meter usage over multiple tenants for a feasibility study, can you use area ratio or kilowatt hour per meter squared for different tenant usages? Is that okay?
That's another big question. I mean, the short answer is yes. When we're looking at, Carrie, you mentioned earlier the Washington Clean Buildings Act. One of the ways that the Clean Buildings Act looks like it's going to approach multi-use buildings is by area used per square foot. And so the problem with this question, or the problem with this approach, obviously, is that the various areas will be, it still averages out the energy use across tenants, even if you do split it up by tenant use. And so you could have a kitchen in one part of your building and an office in another part of your building, and the office would essentially absorb part of the kitchen's higher energy use. So that's not a great way to divide it, if I understand the question correctly.
Okay, another audience question here. How much does building type matter for benchmarking, and what is the level of accuracy of each benchmark for the Energy Star score?
So building type matters less than the type of building for Energy Star score. There's really two questions here. So that in terms of a building type, you can benchmark any building type based on its energy use. And I think Anne can back that up, that you get questions for any type of industrial building or office building or a restaurant for their energy data. So building type, less important. Energy Star score, however, only certain building types can be scored through Energy Star based on what I believe the CBEX, let's see if I can get this right, the Commercial Buildings Energy Consumption Survey. And so only those buildings will be qualified for Energy Star scores.
One other
Okay,
thing.
well, I think,
go
ahead, Anne.
Oh, I was just going to add that the score that the Energy Star gives you is comparing you to other buildings of your type. So if you pick the type that doesn't actually fit your building, your score is not going to be accurate. But that's different than the EUI. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Okay, well, thank you to Seth and Anne. I think that wraps up your session for today. And I am going to introduce my next speaker. I'm pleased to welcome Jim Lazar. Those of us working in policy in the Northwest, he needs no introduction, but Jim is an economist with the Regulatory Assistance Project, and he's going to be speaking with us today about smart homes. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks for joining me. My name is Jim Lazar. I'm here to talk a little bit about the smart house of the future and how the smart house is going to help us meet the challenges of a clean energy world. First, a little bit about RAP, the Regulatory Assistance Project. We are a global non-governmental organization. We have offices in the US, Europe, China, and India. Most of our work is providing training and technical assistance to utility regulators and policymakers as they try to adapt utility regulation to a clean energy world. We have extensive publications available for download for free on our website at raponline.org. A little bit about myself. I'm an economist. I first touched the utility rate proceeding in 1974 when I was still an undergraduate. In the 20 years of my consulting career, I was an expert witness in more than 100 dockets in utility regulatory proceedings across the United States and Canada. For the last 20 years, I've been a RAP senior advisor, and I'm an author of many of RAP's publications. The one I'll highlight is the first one, Electricity Regulation in the U.S., a Guide, is an introduction to how the entire world of utility regulation works, the legal principles, how proceedings operate, how commissions are put together, what they regulate, and how they regulate it. A lot of states are moving to clean energy. This is a list of states that have adopted a 100% clean energy goal. Clean energy typically includes all non-carbon resources, so it does include nuclear. Some of the states are 100% renewable, but most are 100% clean. Rhode Island is the first in 2030, and by 2050, about 15 states comprising almost half the population of the country will require 100% clean energy. Clean energy is going to be challenging. It's going to be challenging to meet customer loads. That is to keep the lights on so that when you turn the switch, things happen. It's not going to be impossible. And there are many studies, but solar alone won't do it. Some people say put in a solar panel. Well, the red line is the summer load on a typical day in Texas. The pink line is the output of a solar project in Texas. Works great during the solar day, but it's not going to keep the lights on at night. Some people say put in a wind farm. A single wind area won't do the job either. Here, the red line again is the summer load in Texas. The gray line is solar from West Texas. Comes up at night, drops down during the day. Or a different wind area. South Texas has a very nice shape in the late afternoon and early evening. That's when the wind is highest. That's good because that's similar to when the utility loads are the highest, but it won't do it alone. Now, if we put them all together, the three different load shapes I showed of South Texas, West Texas, wind, and solar at the bottom, put them all together in green, and it's very close to the red line, close to serving our load. But there are still some pretty important gaps, and a 100% clean energy system will require substantial storage. Nuclear has sort of the same problem in a different way. You can't turn nuclear off at night, and it produces too much power then, and you would need storage to enable nuclear to meet higher loads during the daytime and lower loads at night. So managing these gaps is one of the places that the smart house of the future is going to be important. And now it's not going to look a lot different from the house that you might shop for in today's market, but it's going to work quite a bit different. The smart house is going to have a garage for your cars, it's going to have appliances, it's going to have windows, it's going to have a front door, it's going to have a back door. It's going to work like a house. But let's look at some of the elements of it. First, it will be built to an extremely efficient building code, and I'll talk about building codes later in this presentation, that reduce the energy used to a fraction of what a typical house uses today. It will have high efficiency heat pumps with air exchangers in each room so that you can control the temperature room by room and not heat or cool rooms that you're not using at any particular point in time. Now that heating system could add as much as 4 kW, kilowatts of load to the house if it's not controlled. And we'll be adding these up as we go so you can see how much power a house could draw if we don't control the loads. But the heat pump air conditioner system will have ice storage built onto it, so that on the hottest days of the year, you will make the cold when the power is cheap and clean, store it in the form of ice, and the only electricity you'll need during the hottest hours may be to run the fans or pumps or the other medium to move that cool around and cool the house when the air is hot. But the cooling system could, if it's running uncontrolled, add 4 kW to the house's load. So controlling it is important. It'll have a smart thermostat that will adapt when prices are high or power supplies are low and help control whether the temperature of your house to your selection based on what the price of power is at different times of the day. It will have smart charging of electric vehicles that automatically sense when the power is cheap and make sure your car is charged to the extent you need it. But that smart charger, when it's on, may draw 6, 9, even for a Tesla, 11 kW. Adds quite a bit to the house's peak demand. This house will have a grid-integrated heat pump water heater. Very efficient water heater, stores a lot of hot water, but allows you to use hot water when you want to and make it when the power is cheap and clean. But when that hot water heater is running at full output to catch up from when you've used a lot of hot water, it can add 4 kW of load to the house. It'll have smart appliances. Smart laundry equipment, smart refrigerators, smart dishwashers are already coming onto the market with different kinds of smarts, and the smarts that we'll need will be the smarts that will help us use power when it's cheap and try and avoid using as much as we can during the hours when it's expensive. And those appliances, the biggest one is the clothes dryer, the heat producing appliance. We hope that there will be an ultrasonic clothes dryer available soon. It's been tested in laboratories that will use a lot less power, but those appliances can use another 4 or 5 kW if they were all running at the same time. If we add it all up, the uncontrolled household loads could be a lot. In the case of the examples I've given, it would add up to 22.5 kilowatts of demand. That's about 20 times as much as the average consumption across the year of a typical energy efficient home. 20 times. But if we control the loads that are discretionary, we can take it down below 4 kW during key times of the day when the grid is under stress. By controlling the hot water and using ice storage for air conditioning, turning off the electric vehicle chargers critical hours, we can actually get it down to the point that the entire load of the house can be served by an on-site battery. And most new solar systems being installed are being installed with on-site batteries. And I'll talk about those in just a minute. I think you're going to like the new house. It's going to take a little learning, a little getting used to, but it's going to work better. It's going to feel better. The air quality will be good. The comfort will be good. The energy bills will be much lower, and you'll be able to help your utility supply your community with 100% clean energy. But there's going to be a lot of essential changes that we're going to need in order to do this. I'll talk about some of these. Utility rate design is my personal area of primary expertise. We will need smart storage plants to compensate consumers who have on-site batteries for the utility to use, gain access to those batteries. We'll need new appliance standards to make sure that new appliances are smart and can communicate with a smart grid that needs them in order to work well. There will be changes in building code. A lot of those are already underway, both to make buildings more efficient, but also to make them smarter. And we will need consumer education and consumer protection in order to make sure that consumers can use this technology and are not adversely affected by utilities. So I'll start with rate design. RAP published a couple of publications in the last couple of years. The first, Smart Rate Design for a Smart Future. I was a lead author of this one, and a companion volume, Smart Non-Residential Rate Design, aimed at commercial and industrial rates. It's available for free download on our website at raponline.org. The first principle in these publications is that a customer should be allowed to connect to the grid for no more than the cost of connecting to the grid. And by connect to the grid, I mean the final connection shown here in these circles between the shared grid and the individual customer premises. Typically, the final line transformer, which may be shared with other customers, and the service connection, which is generally unique to the individual building, but in an apartment or condo or duplex, it's shared with more than one residence. The second principle is the customer should pay for power supply and for grid services in proportion to how much they use and when they use it. Let's start with how much they use. Single-family homes, shown here at the top, use power a lot differently. They use more power and they use it at different times than apartments, shown here at the bottom, and shouldn't pay the same amount for power or for grid services because the costs of service are very different for different customers. Part of this principle is paying for power when we use it. Most of us leave our refrigerator on all day and all night, and refrigerators are really relatively cheap to serve because they have very steady usage on the utility. We only turn our air conditioners on when it's hot, and that's only some of the time. And in most utilities, the peak hours are correlated with the periods when the most air conditioners are turned on, usually in the late afternoon, early evening on weekdays. And then there's some loads, like electric vehicles and water heaters, where we actually have some discretion about when we use power. And we've learned that customers can, will, and do control those kinds of loads in response to appropriate time-varying prices. And the third principle is that customers delivering power to the grid should receive full and fair value, no more and no less, for the power and grid services that they provide. And smart inverters today are providing a whole suite of grid services in many parts of the world, not just kilowatt hours here and there when they're surplus. So now I'm going to show a smart rate design that follows these principles. It has specific components. First, the cost to connect to the grid, a monthly charge for billing and collection to issue and process the bill, and then the cost of the line transformer and the service drop to the house. Typically not a very big charge, about $1 a kW per month, or about typically $2 for a typical apartment, maybe $5 to $7 for a typical single-family home. It can be as much as $20 for a single-family home in a rural area that has a dedicated transformer, one transformer for one house. But for most of us, it shouldn't be a big charge. Next, charges that should be bidirectional, that you pay them when you're taking power to the grid, and they're credited to you when you're supplying power to the grid, back to the grid, for the grid services and power supply. And these, we've put them into a 3-period time of use rate: off-peak, mid-peak, and on-peak. Some utilities have chosen 2 periods. And the right rate design for your community will depend on the mix of resources and the nature of customer loads. But half as expensive during the off-peak hours as during the on-peak hours. But then we add one more feature to it, which is a critical peak charge that kicks in during the 10 to 50 hours a year. When the grid is under stress, the utility will give the customer notice. The smart house will receive that notice and automatically turn off all of the non-critical loads. The customer will get notice by text or email or by an in-home display where the light starts blinking, flashing red, and knows that those are hours to not try and do laundry or dishes. Just wait a couple hours. These kinds of rates have been in place for a long time in some places. In France, the tempo rate has been in effect for more than 30 years. It primarily applies to large homes, but it's worked very well there. They have an inflexible power supply in France, mostly nuclear, and they've used this type of rate design to get customers to adapt their usage to the inflexible resources that make up the majority of their power supply. So moving on from rate design, the next thing I mentioned is smart storage plans, where most new solar systems are coming with batteries. Customers like those. It means that their power can stay on during an outage. Green Mountain Power has an excellent program where the customer pays half the cost of the batteries. The utility pays half the cost of the batteries. Normally, the utility controls the batteries. And so during peak hours, they serve the house from the batteries. And at other times, they might serve from the grid and charge up the batteries to the extent that the solar system doesn't provide what the customer needs. During a power outage, take the grid on the left side of this picture off of it. The solar system charges the batteries, the house runs off of the batteries, and customers don't experience a power outage. Now, the smart house may tell them, this is a bad time to do laundry. We don't have enough power to support doing laundry, or maybe the red light will be flashing, and you'll know this is not a good time to take a long shower or fill the hot tub. But this gives customers reliability in an outage. It gives the grid the flexibility of being able to get services like frequency regulation, voltage support from batteries. Distributed through the system helps the utility avoid putting high peak demands on the regional transmission grid and out-of-state power supplies. We'll see more of these smart storage plants. We've got a few utilities implementing them already. I mentioned appliance standards. They'll need to apply to air conditioners and heat pumps as we electrify all of our loads and leave fossil fuels behind. We're going to need to have standards that require, I think, air conditioners to have storage built into them. And I think that will probably come in the form of ice. It may be that batteries get cheap enough that they're a better choice. We'll have standards for water heaters, for laundry equipment, dishwashers, and spas and pool pumps. I'm just going to touch on a couple of examples here. I'll start with controlled water heaters. There's more than 2 million utility controlled water heaters in the US today. Most of them are on rural electric cooperatives that have very limited distribution grid capacity. But more and more they're becoming mainstream, and customers are getting a bill credit for allowing the utility to control their water heater to heat water when the power is cheap and coast through on the 50 gallons of hot water in the tank when the power is expensive. Washington State has taken one further step. Beginning next year, every water heater manufactured for sale in the state of Washington will be required to have what's called the CTA 2045 socket. This is a socket you can see here in the bottom left of the picture that allows the utility or an aggregator or the customer to plug in a controller to the water heater. The water heater doesn't come with the controls built in, but rather some utilities will use cellular-based controllers, some will use internet-based controllers, some will use pager-based controllers. But whatever system is being used in your area, you can simply plug the controller in and it will allow your water heater to become a smart water heater. Only adds about $1 to the cost of the water heater to put the socket on it, and you don't spend money on control systems that aren't going to be used that way. Water heaters only last about 15 years, 10 to 15 years. So by 2035, virtually every electric water heater in the state of Washington, that's 2 million of them, will have the ability to be controlled. 2 million water heaters is 9,000 megawatts of potential load control. It's a big deal. Water heaters are a great opportunity. Laundry equipment is already pretty smart. I mean, they've got load size sensors and wash time sensors. They know when it's time to start rinsing. Once they've started rinsing, they know when it's time to start spinning. But coming soon, washers, I think, will have an economy wash controller. That is, to put the clothes in when you leave for work or when you go to bed, and the washer will wait until he gets a signal through the smart house network that power costs are down and it's time to start washing your clothes so that they're ready for you when you need them. Building codes will be a big part of rolling out the smart house. Now, we've done a tremendous amount. Houses built today use about 1/3 as much energy for heating and cooling as those that were built 20 years ago. And the 2021 International Energy Conservation Code will have even higher efficiency levels than we have today. Ultimately, we will get to where houses have zero net energy requirements. That is, they produce as much as they consume. In California, starting this year, on-site production, that is solar, is required for most new homes. There are some exceptions for those that are built in places where there's no access, and there are community solar solutions in that situation that builders can participate in. But by 2030, California's code will require zero net energy even for commercial buildings. And here in the Northwest, in Seattle, we have a great example of this, the Bullitt Center near downtown Seattle, that was built 10 years ago. It is a zero net energy building. It produces as much energy as it consumes. Its total consumption is about 1/4 of what a typical building would be. And it has solar on its roof that produces that amount. Yes, even in the cloudy, rainy Seattle climate. So building codes will be a big part of the smart home transition. The last area that I think is really important to have in mind is consumer education. We're going to have time varying rates. Those are a little complicated. They need to be understandable enough for consumers to figure them out, predictable enough that home energy controllers can become set and forget appliances, and we'll have to educate consumers on what those rates are and how to use their home energy controllers. They're going to have to be software enabled so the customers can access a user-friendly interface, in this case shown for a Tesla on the phone. In the case of the dishwasher, it's right in the foreground. There's the delay button. Most of you probably already have that delay button on your dishwasher, and as soon as your utility adopts time of use rates, you'll fill the dishwasher after dinner, hit the delay button, go on about your business, and when the rates go down at 11 or 12 at night, the dishwasher will come on, and by morning, your dishes will be clean. We're also going to have to make sure the consumer protection functions of our attorneys general and other consumer protection offices are adequately staffed and trained to help consumers with any dishonest or disreputable marketers of energy management technology. There hasn't been a lot of that, but there has been some. And as the rates get more complicated and the technology gets more complicated, we will see some of that happen. To summarize all of this, smart houses here. New houses built today have tremendous technology in them. They will get smarter. They will have more technology in them in the future. Your cars have gotten smarter, and your house will also get smarter. We need to get smarter. We need to learn how to use this technology to save money on our energy bill and to adapt to a power supply that is increasingly made up of very low-cost wind and very low-cost solar resources to help manage the amount of energy storage that we have to invest in to make the system work economically for all of us. The result, if we do a good job, will be lower costs. Lower costs for the utility system, lower costs on our energy bill. Better reliability with on-site batteries, on-site solar. In a multi-day power outage, our houses will be able to supply at least their essential loads themselves, and significantly less environmental harm. We can do this. We must do this. The eyes of the world are upon us.
Okay, well, thank you, Jim. It's always really exciting to hear about the promise of smart technologies to help us accelerate and achieve the needed transition to a clean grid. We're going to take some questions from the audience now. First question, which of the major smart home technologies are furthest ahead in deployment? Which are still evolving towards deployment?
Well, probably the leaders at this point are the smart electric vehicle charger and the grid integrated water heater. There's a terrific program in Vermont and another good one in Minnesota using smart EV chargers. They've been able to get 90, even 95% of the electric vehicle charging into the low-cost off-peak periods in those states. That technology is available. It's ready to be deployed as soon as we have the rate design in the Northwest that rewards people for doing that. The water heaters is another. I mentioned there are a couple of million grid integrated water heaters, mostly in the co-op service territories, but Washington State has already taken a step to, over the next 15 years, basically all 2 million electric water heaters that we now have, plus those that are converted from other fuels in the future in new construction, will have the ability to be readily controlled. There's probably the one that's got the most challenges is the ice storage air conditioner. These are available and used extensively in large commercial buildings. University campuses use millions of gallons of chilled water storage, and some tall office buildings or big hotels have ice banks. But at the residential level, there was only one manufacturer in that field, and that manufacturer has failed and gone bankrupt. So that's the one that's, I think, the furthest from being ready for deployment.
Okay, another question. For students looking to enter into the smart energy industry, what would you recommend he or she study right now?
Both physical science and political science, a little bit of economics. And the most important thing for me was actually my literature freshman composition class, where I learned how to write. Being able to express yourself in the written word is really, really important.
Well, As a former English major, I appreciate that. Which states and utilities are doing the best job integrating customer batteries into the grid to provide grid services?
Well, the best I mentioned is Green Mountain Power in Vermont and Liberty Utilities in New Hampshire are well ahead, and Hawaii is catching up. Nearly all new solar systems in Hawaii are having batteries installed with them, and Sunrun, at least, is already beginning to aggregate those batteries to sell their capacity to the utility as a package.
Okay, another question. Is there any opportunity to have old appliances retrofitted with smart systems?
There is. One of the major players in grid integrated water heating, Aquanta, has an add-on box that's just it connects to the thermostats on heating elements on the water heater, and it's an off water heater box. There's another company, Shifted Energy, makes one of those, and uh, those are uh, uh, available to add on to an existing electric water heater. But as I mentioned, electric water heaters typically only last 10 to 15 years. Smart thermostats can work with older heat pump systems. And Nest did I thought, a very interesting demonstration during the total solar eclipse of taking uh, about 1,000 megawatts of load offline when the solar systems in the West went offline during that eclipse. And they only had 2% of the water heaters under their control. If we had 50%, 2% of the thermostats under the control. If we had 50% of the thermostats or 80% of the thermostats under control, the 2-hour sink in solar output could have been completely offset by pre-cooling houses or pre-heating houses and then coasting through the eclipse or some other temporary shortfall in power supply.
Okay, another question from the audience. If beneficial electrification really takes off, what are the most critical smart house elements that need to be included in the electrification of homes to assure that the electric grid remains reliable?
As we electrify transportation, we're going to need smart, interactive electric vehicle controllers. My electric vehicle controller is not smart. I come home, I plug in. If it's 4 in the afternoon, I'm contributing to the afternoon peak. It needs to at least be smart enough to tell me if you really want to charge right now, you have to push the override button and be prepared to pay extra. Or if you're willing to let me wait until it's a little cheaper, I can do that. And that can just be a green or red button on the app, either on the dash of the car or on the charger or on the smartphone or other control device. The water heaters are very, very important, partly because they're so easy and cheap to do, and customers generally don't notice when their water heater is turned off for half an hour or an hour or a couple of hours, because the 50-gallon storage in the water heater carries most houses through an entire day. Getting to where we have thermal storage for heating and cooling is where I think we have the most technical challenge. And there's the most opportunity for technological innovation. And as I said earlier, it may be that batteries become cheap enough that storing that power as electricity rather than storing it as heat or cool may be the better option.
Okay, another question. Who is best known for thermal storage for heating, and where is it used most in the US? Do you know any specific projects?
Well, probably the most are the ground source heat pumps in a number of areas that draw their heat from a reservoir of ground. And in the summer, they take cool out of the ground and pump it into the house, and that heats up they take heat out of the house and pump it into the ground, and that cools off the house in the summer, but it also warms up the ground, and then in winter, the process is reversed. There are, I mean, I've been to a few demonstration houses where they have, 600 gallons of hot water storage run off of a heat pump water heater, and operated through a hydronic heating system, so that you're storing the heat for the house in the form of hot water. And those are not common. As I say, this is where we need some real technological innovation.
Okay, next question. Is it more important to deploy smart house technologies in hot climates like Texas or in cold climates like Wisconsin and Minnesota?
Well, I think that initially the electric grid is seeing more stress, and so the hot climates are going to be more important, and addressing air conditioning is a higher priority, and that's good because we know how to do that pretty well. But as we electrify heating demand and eliminate the use of fossil fuels for space heat, even California, which is a very strongly summer peaking area, becomes a winter peaking area with about half of their current heating load converted to electricity. So we'll be needing to address heating storage soon.
Okay. Well, a lot to think about. Thank you, Jim. And that concludes our session on energy policy in the Pacific Northwest. Thanks everyone for attending.
Wow, what a great first day. I'd like to thank everyone for attending and participating today, day one of the AEE West Virtual Energy Conference and Expo. We started out with a fantastic opening this morning from Dr. Martin Keller, good networking, visiting with our exhibitors in the virtual expo, and an informative conference sessions this afternoon. So looking ahead, we want to preview day two. We kick off tomorrow morning with a keynote plenary with one of our co-hosts, Seattle City Light. We're honored and fortunate to have Deborah Smith, General Manager and CEO of Seattle City Light, opening our program tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. I'd like to also say we'll have a live question and answer session with Ms. Smith immediately following her remarks. Following that, we'll have at 10:30 to 11 our second day, round two of our Innovative Technology Showcase, rapid fire preview of the latest technologies and solutions from our exhibitors, with our virtual expo hall, 10:30 until 12:30 p.m. The AE membership and certification booth will be open, attending networking in the virtual expo. Have a short break for lunch, and in the afternoon, two concurrent conference sessions. First one, incentives, financing, and utility programs. The second concurrent session, building success stories. So we certainly invite you to join us for day two, and thanks for your attendance, and we will see you tomorrow.